It's my pleasure to introduce our presenter and discussant. Curtis Ogden and this is a homecoming, he's a native of Flint. So Curtis has served as Senior Associate at the Interaction Institute for Social Change. Does that have any some kind of cool acronym sounding name?
IISC is not necessarily cool, but that's what it is.
Okay. Well, he's been at the Institute since 2005. He has extensive experience in community building, leadership development, program design, and a burning passion for work at the intersection of racial justice, environmental sustainability. For the past several years, he's built a really robust practice in support of numerous, what we call multi-stakeholder collaborative change networks. That's a mouthful, but the examples, some of you might be familiar with examples like Food Solutions New England, the Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture, and Sustainability, the Vermont Farm to Plate Network, the Connecticut, right from the start, the Education Justice Network. He's a recognized thought leader. Again, I've seen his name appear on marquees all over the country. I haven't seen him in any movie theaters, but there's definitely a lot of marquees. And as a thought leader in network development and social change, I really think he'll challenge you about thinking about how you view your network. Everybody knows the Capital One commercial where you see what's in your wallet. You don't watch TV, you don't watch the Capital One commercial. But it's about a credit card and see what's in your wallet. I think it's a thoughtful reflection about whether it's a council or an association or network, what really is happening in your own networking organization. I think we all know the power of stories, and I think Curtis is going to do a really good job here of interweaving his message with some really personal stories of his own experiences. So let's give a return welcome to a native son, Curtis Ogden.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Morning.
And it's good to be here. It's really a pleasure and definitely a privilege. I walk in the world very aware of who I am and who I was popped out in the world as a small, straight, white guy with formal education, and carry that awareness with me. And to the extent that unearned privilege opens up opportunities like this for me, I'm always aware that I want that to be a pathway to creating more justice and more love in this world. So may that be so. And as Rich said, this is very much a homecoming for me. It's great to be back in Michigan. It's great to be back in East Lansing, where I did not go to school, but I pretended to. My dad got his second master's at MSU, and when I was in high school, we used to take the trip together, and I'd study in the undergraduate library and just pretend I was in college. It was so cool. It's also a homecoming of sorts because I'm in a room with people who are working on the issues that I care about most. We talk about food, and we talk about health of people, health of communities. So I just want to thank you heartily for the work that you're doing in my native Flint, throughout the state, and certainly all the ripples that's creating beyond the state borders. I'm definitely at home having a conversation about networks, and as Rich said, I don't know about the marquees, but I am getting a few more invitations to come and speak to people about network theory. And one of the things I want to be clear about is that I am not a theorist, I'm a practitioner, and Rich alluded to that earlier. These are some of the networks that I've had the privilege of working with, and some that I continue to work with. But I'm also a bit of a network geek in the sense that I hang out with scientists at the Research Alliance for Regenerative Economics. We're studying networks and the way that network dynamics can contribute to all kinds of health ecosystems in economies and communities. And so I really believe in that marrying of theory and practice. And I've also learned over time that when I'm invited in to give a talk about theory, beginning with theory can be disastrous. So we're not going to do that. I'm going to lead with some story, some anecdotes, and we'll back that up with some theory and concepts. And just to be clear, I will not be talking to you for an hour. God help us if that was the case. We will take at least a couple of breaks for you to talk to one another and digest some of what I'm putting out there. And I'm also well aware that there are probably multiple starting points around networks and different understandings of networks, so I'm trying to account for that. A little bit of 101, maybe a little bit of 201, maybe a little bit of 301. And so the expectation is not that all of this is going to meet you where you are, and the encouragement is not to digest everything, but just go through those things that speak to you. And the hope is that at least one thing will help to sharpen your saw as you move forward working under networks. While I'm here alone, I did just want to acknowledge that I'm not really alone. I'm connected to these beautiful people at the Interaction Institute for Social Change, with whom I have the pleasure of working and learning with and from. So I carry them very much with me everywhere I go. And we're united at this thing called the Interaction Institute for Social Change. Yes, IISC rolls right off the tongue. Our current mission is this: to catalyze the will and skill of the diverse public, I sometimes like to say diverse publics, to create and sustain social justice and sustainability. And we do that through training, facilitation, consulting, coaching, and the like. And important to note is that we bring this grounding lens to all of the work that we do. We have a perspective when we come in to do this work. And so as we do our capacity building, it is through this, think about a prism that refracts the light of collaboration. We see it breaking into these different streams. Number one, paying attention to power, and looking at how power plays out in rooms and networks and communities, and trying to build power in the pursuit of equity and ensuring inclusion, especially for those who are typically left out of the conversation, especially for those who systems are failing pretty fundamentally. Secondly, and what we're here to talk about, though connected to these other strands, is networks. We view the fundamental unit of change as networks, not individuals, not organizations, but these bodies that transcend these bodies and our organizational bodies, and through those deeper connections and flows, that's how we see change happen. We'll talk more about that. And then finally, we talk about and focus on love as a force for social change. And this is love not as the squishy Hallmark version. I think it was Cornel West who once said that justice is what love looks like in public. So this is love with teeth. It's love that allows us to cross boundaries and see each other more fully in our full humanity, and to accept the complexity in ourselves and in one another. And so it's the union of these different facets of our prism that we bring to our collaborative capacity building. So with that in place, I'm going to pivot, maybe a radical departure from theory, and offer a little poetry. And this is the first stanza from one of my favorite poems that I've offered to every network that I've worked with. And to me, it captures the essence of what this network building work is really about. And this is from William Stafford, who wrote a poem called The Ritual to Read to Each Other. So the first stanza goes, if you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. You don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, then a pattern others made may prevail in the world. And following the wrong God at home, we may miss our star. So a personal story. In the last several months, my wife and I had a chance to meet up with a couple. This was sort of an arranged couples date. My wife is from Vermont, and the husband of this other couple is from Vermont. His parents and her parents said, you guys got to get together and meet each other. So we got together for lunch and tea, and they thought that we'd have a lot to talk about, and we in fact did. It was a very long, delightful lunch. And at one point, we got into a conversation, to be clear, that she is from Nepal, and he's from Vermont, and they both do disaster relief work and community development work. And so as part of the conversation, they relayed this harrowing experience they had in 2015. You remember the Nepali earthquake that struck. Well, they had gone to the country on vacation to see family and friends, and when the earthquake struck, they were actually out in the countryside hiking. It was a 7.8 magnitude earthquake. So they were definitely shaken, but not harmed. And once they got their bearings, they made their way back to Kathmandu and checked in on family and friends to make sure that they were okay.
And having assured that they were all right, they then did what disaster relief workers do. That's work. They started off hauling these gigantic water jugs onto trucks that went out into the countryside. And once all of that heavy lifting was done, they made it clear that they spoke the local language and they enlisted technical expertise and translation skills. And so they headed out into the country, and they came to this one particularly remote village that had just been leveled. Most of the structures were either tumbling down or had little structural integrity. But there was one building in this village where the lights were on, and there was a buzz coming from it. So the couple approached this building, hearing the buzz inside, and they opened the door. It took a moment for their eyes to adjust to the busyness that was going on in there. When their eyes did adjust, they realized that people were not there clamoring for medical attention, not for food, not for water. They were clamoring for this generator so that they could plug in their cell phones. So it took this couple of minutes to kind of understand what was going on, and they realized, well, of course, they need their devices so they can connect with loved ones, let them know they're okay, and learn from others that they're okay, and tune into the news. It was in that moment they realized people need to stay connected. So they headed back to Kathmandu and started working their networks, and were able to procure this set of solar-powered generators, which they then deployed back into the countryside at these different rural hubs in the form of elementary schools that were very accessible in these communities. And when they went back around to tour these facilities, they were just overwhelmed by the gratitude of these villagers for these generators. And in relaying the story, it was interesting. There were several times where they'd shake their heads and kind of smile. And earlier on, I felt like it was more about, really cell phones? That's what people wanted? And later in the conversation, it was more a reflection on their own failure to see how fundamental connection really is, right? And we know that. That connection is so fundamental to our sense of security, of safety, of health, and of ourselves. And we've now witnessed a number of other natural disasters in which that very scenario where people are clamoring for cell phones and cell phone chargers is played out, including during Hurricane Sandy. I'm working with a group of people doing climate resiliency planning work in New York City and the South Bronx. And what my colleague Michael Primo has relayed is that after Sandy, there was a similar, just this almost uprising of give us these charging stations, so much so that FEMA and the Emergency Management Services have changed the classification of what constitutes a critical facility to include charging stations. Right? Connection is fundamental. It's so fundamental to life because, in fact, life is a network. Life is a network. And we know this because when we're feeling alive, we generally feel connected. And when we're not feeling alive, it's often because we're disconnected, we're cut off in some way, shape, or form from other people, from nature, from a sense of purpose or power. At the end of the day, life really thrives on connection. I love this quote from Grace Lee Boggs, the long-term Detroit-based community organizer who passed away at 100 a few years ago. She often said that in organizing work, it's not just about creating critical mass, it's about focusing on critical connections. It's just not mass, it's connections. When you make that critical tie between people, between ideas, between people and ideas, that's when you see things shift. That connection can actually change what's connected. And that really is at base what network theory is all about, is we can reduce it down to its essentials. Network theory is very much an evolving field, beginning with this acknowledgement that much the way we see the world is about seeing something individually or individual and understanding them in and of themselves. If you know more about them, then you know more about them. But that works really in simple and fairly disconnected systems. As soon as you get these systems and start to ramp up their complexity, their interactions, and their diversity, it's the connections and the interactions between those elements that define the health of those elements and the health of the entire system. So I have a colleague, Sally Gerner, who I work with at the Research Alliance for Regenerative Economics, and her passion is to study something called the energy network sciences. It's to look at how energy moves in different networks, so nutrients, money, ideas, communication, and how connectivity and flow contribute to overall systemic flourishing or not. And one of the things she likes to say, this quote, long-term prosperity is primarily a function of healthy human webs. And when she says prosperity, that's not just wealth. It's health, it's justice, it's being learned. And there are many contributing factors to what creates these healthy human webs, and that's part of what the science is looking at right now. But for the moment, the shorthand, some of the elements that we've been able to lift up are that healthy webs, healthy networks are characterized by a diversity of elements, an intricacy of connections and connectivity, and a robustness of flows of ideas. That's what makes these networks healthy and resilient over time. So I get pretty worked up about this and feeling like this is the new gospel that we've got to take out to social change efforts, right? Let's start paying attention to these patterns of connection and the flows. Not just so that we can create networks so that we can work on this, but by creating networks, we're actually already working on systems, playing with patterns of connections and flows. So I want to give you one other story to bring some of this home, bringing a network mindset and strategic intent can impact, have real impacts. And this is a health-related case, and then we'll break and give you a chance to talk to one another. So the setting for this particular case is Boston, and it begins with the Barr Foundation, one of the largest foundations in the state of Massachusetts. And staff at the Barr Foundation were looking at a couple of their portfolios. So these were two separate portfolios. On the one hand, they had a portfolio that was dedicated to green buildings, and on the other, a separate portfolio looking at healthy buildings. So green buildings were generally focused on considerations about climate change, emissions from buildings, and what we could do to mitigate climate change. Healthy buildings, on the other hand, that portfolio was looking at how runoff into water, into the air, was contributing to things like asthma and other kinds of chemically created diseases. So the senior program officer at the time, Mariela Tanpuerta, was looking at these two separate portfolios and saying, neither one seems to be making much progress, and surely there's something that ties them together. Right? Green buildings, healthy buildings, all about buildings. It has sort of this environmental concern. Maybe we should bring them together. So she met with Roberto Cremonini, who was the chief knowledge officer at Barr at the time, and said, maybe we should do something. Maybe we should pull these grantees together. So they reached out to my colleague Beth Tenner and said, let's create a convening. Let's invite people together. We'll pay for everything, pay for food, we'll pay for travel. And when we pull together people, let's not just have a conversation. Let's have them focused on a network map. Let's do some mapping of these two different networks. So they set out to do this, creating a network map. And the basic question that they asked to create this map, and anytime you look at a network map, it's helpful to know what the question was that animates that map. In this case, it was who knows each other in these networks. So up here you see these nodes of green and red, denoting the environment and then health nodes. So what do you notice as you look at that map? A lot of connections? A lot of very strong connections. So the how dense the line is about the quality of the connection. Anything else you notice? Two groups, pretty separate, yeah, with some ties, but you begin to see how the green and the red are fairly separate, and there are a few different hubs that jump out, hubs being those nodes with multiple connections. That would be the funder, and that would be a couple of state agencies and a couple well-connected organizations. So they showed this map during that convening. This was not news to anybody. But there was something about seeing the visual that sent off light bulbs about maybe the missed opportunity here in front of us. Why is that so? So their enthusiasm started to rise, and they began to do some other kinds of mapping, including looking at the different campaigns of the organizations, who were the key target audiences, looking at where there was overlap that was helpful, overlap that was redundant, and where there might have been glaring gaps. And so that just continued to grow their enthusiasm, feeling like there's something really strategic here that we're getting at. It led then through some additional mapping to some strategic pairings of leaders in the networks who they thought should come together and have lunch together. Not for the sake of enjoying a lunch, but to help tie together the overall network, tying together strategic nodes. So what happened over time, over the course of 2 years, this continued to grow, this enthusiasm continued to grow. And they did another map 2 years later. And so this is what they noticed. Here's the map 2 years later. 2005, 2007. So many more ties. You don't see those sort of distinct camps anymore. You see a heavy gradation to more of the lines, meaning people know each other better. So it's a nice social network map. Why does it matter?
You need each other.
Just need each other?
And the things are interconnected, so it's a systems approach. It allows for a systems approach.
So it's actually tying more of the system together. So I think Francisco Varela once said, he was a system biologist, said that when a system is unhealthy, you need to tie it to more of itself. Right? So you can get more of that feedback, more of that coherence, more of that alignment. And that is in fact what started to happen. Over time, it's not just that there were deeper relationships, there was expanded knowledge of one another's work. That played into greater alignment and coordination of efforts, including going to the city en masse and making demands. That translated into enhanced access to key decision makers. That led to an integration of the network's objectives into city projects, which actually led to real changes in building code and to emissions drops. And it also led to plenty of emergent opportunities, self-organized opportunities, where people would get together, meet with one another, going on grants together. There was this kind of flourishing, this kind of abundance mindset that came into play, whereas previously the camps were kind of hoarding, taking what was there, and kind of, I'm gonna take my marbles and go off here. So I'm gonna say something just about a couple of concepts and then invite you to have a conversation at tables. The message I take away from this particular case study is that when we are intentional about and attentive to being a network and what that means, and we're strategic, it can create the value and the promise that networks stand to offer. So what are networks? Networks are basically sets of nodes and links. They're things that are connected, that together create something that individually none of the nodes could create, right? And so those networks could be people, they could be organizations, they could be computer terminals, they could be destinations that airlines fly to. So one of the questions that often comes up is, well, are networks really new, right? And we've had coalitions, we've had alliances, we've had collaboratives. And what I would say to that is, they're not new, we've always had networks, but there's something about being mindful of networks and the science behind them that can help us get to these marvelous things called network effects. So whether you're an organization or alliance or a coalition, acting like a network, being attentive to certain kinds of network structures and behaviors can unleash these things, including small world reach, right? We used to say that it was 6 degrees of separation, it's now 2.5 degrees of separation because there's much more connectivity in our worlds. And that matters because we can reach across boundaries, right? We can reach across difference. We can access different mindsets that can lead to innovation. There's adaptive capacity. Actually, let me come back to rapid dissemination first. There's a way that when you have this real intricate connectivity, that ideas can spread like fire.
Wildflowers.
So these memes that we see out there, right, on Twitter, like Me Too, Black Lives Matter, right? There's that kind of fire spreading when you got that connectivity. Adaptive capacity and resilience are related. Resilient networks do not rely on one central node, right? Because if that node goes away, it all collapses. But when you have that robust connectivity, something can go away and the network can absorb that shock. And that leads to an ability to adapt, right? To reconfigure around challenges and shocks. And when there's robust information flowing, then that network is much more intelligent and adaptive. And beyond that, when you consider the kinds of values that I hear come from individuals and networks that participate, This is just really a short list. In these robust networks, people feel enlivened by the inspiration they're getting, the support, the learning, the new tools, the prestige. For some smaller organizations, it's an opportunity to have their voices and their work amplified and shared, right, through these myriad connections, and certainly these new partnerships that emerge, new joint projects and activities. And the cool thing is when you take that individual value and you feed it back into the system, you can see this kind of flourishing. James Fowler and Nicholas Christakis have done this marvelous research looking at how things like health and happiness are actually properties of networks, not of individuals, but that relies on connectivity, a real flow between different parts. So I'm inclined to, I realize I've been talking for a little bit here, and I had something else I wanted to get to, but I'm going to pause right there. I'm going to ask you if you could turn to a colleague at your table, just share something that you feel like is coming up for you as you hear this. Is there an insight? Is there an aha? Is there an amen? Is there a question? Just turn to a partner. Wherever you are in your conversation, welcome back. So I'd just be curious to understand what's coming up. Anything you'd like to share? What's coming up so far? Yes?
To me, in some of what you said, people know I drive a long way and I have a lot of these meetings. People are like, I can't believe you always drive. But it's that being part of that network and being able to hear what other people are doing and bring that back to the area I serve and to make those connections. People know what I'm working on and bring resources to me or include us in their work. It's really important. A lot of what you say about that feeling of networks is really important to the work I do. I cover a large territory, but very isolated.
Absolutely. Yeah, networks so crucial for breaking out of isolation. And isolation over time leads to stagnation, to death ultimately, right? And so network theory is showing that in multiple domains, economics, environment, personal, human health, isolation is deadly, right? And connection is vitality. It is.
On that same sort of note, I was thinking, can you, these personal conversations that you're having over lunch or whatnot, can you create that same sort of connection if you can't travel? Are you able to make those connections over the phone? Are you able to build that same kind of strength connection there?
Yeah, I would say, my personal preference, right, is the more in-person. Yeah. There's just sort of a quality, of course, that you can't beat. But there are great examples of vast networks that rely on technology that are doing remarkable work. And I think as more people are becoming digitally native, right, there's more of a comfort in operating in those realms. And it does require a certain kind of facilitation and arts to it, right, to make time for personal connection, storytelling. Those kinds of things that I think are crucial. But if you haven't heard of Occupy Sandy, that was an amazing digital network and in-person network that responded to Sandy in the wake of that disaster. And it was so successful that FEMA is taking lessons from it about how decentralized networks are better able to adapt than often some of the federal government approaches. All right, I'm going to move on just a couple more slides and then invite you back into a conversation. So not every network achieves these effects, these glorious network effects, or people coming away feeling like, wow, that was a good use of my time, right? And so again, that's where some of this intention and attention can be crucial. So this is one of my favorite frameworks. It comes from the work of Madeline Taylor and Pete Plastrick. It's adjusted a little bit. This actually is a framework that we use with Food Solutions New England that Tom Kelly, our convener, refers to as our religious symbol. This is one of the handouts too that we'll ask you to work on shortly. So the idea here is that this is kind of a grossly oversimplified typology of different kinds of social change networks. And the idea is that one is not necessarily better than the other, but foundationally, most networks thrive on a certain level of connectivity. People really know each other. And so there's certain networks that are just about building connection. All they're doing is building stronger connections and trust, and that can yield something, right, that we take back home with us. It's about sharing knowledge, creating new knowledge, and creating new resource channels. as well as developing a better understanding of the system. When people come together and they have a conversation, they're taking some new kind of understanding of the context away with them. And so I would say most networks thrive with some kind of foundation of connection. You sometimes see networks that get away from that and suffer as a result. Other networks may move up a level, again, not meaning that it's better, to focus on creating some kind of alignment. So it's not just about 1,000 flowers blooming, but they're trying to bloom in the same direction. So this isn't that we're all coordinating action together necessarily, but we're aligning around context or reality, some understanding of the system that we're working on, achieving certain kinds of conceptual congruence around shared terms like sustainability or justice or health even. And then creating and promoting shared vision and values. And with Food Solutions New England, we've seen that just add tremendous value. Organizations started to align around the food vision. You just felt like there was momentum in more of a common direction. And then other networks may choose to move to this level or jump to this level of coordinated action, like let's get something done. A campaign, a fundraising effort, creating a new project. So it's all good and it's all connected. The idea is that through these different modes, you're creating some kind of both connection and alignment. But again, the purple you see as being really, really crucial. When you start to lose that, it's harder to get to those other levels. The other way to be intentional and thoughtful about networks is through this lens of structure. So there are different kinds of structures. This image is also on my handout that I invite you to spend some time with shortly. So this is a gross oversimplification, but to make a point. There are some networks that are what are called hub and spoke networks. They have a dominant hub through which almost everything passes, and you've got this periphery, which is not really well connected. It's not a bad network. Actually, this may be the first step of the network beginning to cohere. You have these disparate nodes. Somebody steps in and says, I need to let's pull together. So that can create some coherence, some direction, some momentum. And what we know about centralized networks is over time they can become brittle and inefficient because everything relies on the hub. And even if the hub doesn't go away, the hub can get tired of answering all those questions and requests. By the way, you all know something. Why don't you talk to each other? Which is where this dense cluster mesh comes in. Another kind of network where actors in a network are tied more to one another. And this can be great for developing trust and efficiency and being able to self-organize and get projects done. It's more of a closed network. And it can become fairly insular, right? And lose touch. I'm sure you've been part of those groups, you know about them. The cult, if you will. Doesn't have to be that extreme. And another form of network is the distributed multi-tier, where you've got multiple hubs connected with their own kind of periphery. And these are networks that can be great for really disseminating information and mobilizing people rapidly. Occupy Sandy is a great example of this. You have these key organizational hubs in different geographies that could get things out quickly to their networks while also being connected at this core. So structure matters in terms of what we're able to do. So the invitation is to think about what the structure of your network is, to pick one of these. And often they're connected. And one other point to make about structure is that structure typically evolves over time. I don't believe in many things as being purely linear, but there is research that suggests that a somewhat healthy progression is when a network moves from these scattered fragments to the hub and spoke, that the hub and spoke moves to a multi-hub, where it's not just one hub in the middle, multiple hubs that are connected, to this core periphery model, where there's a much more dense core connected to this much more robust periphery. And that can get, that kind of, in many ways, embraces the best of all of these network forms. And there are a couple of great examples that we've been working with health networks that are looking strategically about how to evolve as a network. One is this national network called Oral Health 2020 that the DentaQuest Foundation has been working on. We've been working with them for the past several years. They're focused on oral health, not just as a health issue, but as a justice issue, as an equity issue, and as oral health not as being just about oral health, but physical and mental health. And so their work has been to recognize that a lot of people are trying to do this work, but they've been disconnected. Our work with them has been to help them connect with the DentaQuest Foundation as the center. And now we're pivoting to help them so that the foundation isn't the center of everything. And even in that work that we've done so far, we're beginning to see results in terms of coalitions forming, getting things done, raising money, moving policy, and also organizations who are at the table taking their network mindset back to their own communities and including grassroots partners more robustly and using more of this network expertise around how to have a more robust media and communications presence. So really getting the word out about oral health as a justice issue in a way that they hadn't seen previously. There's another network that I won't get into details, but it's a sex education network that I've worked with that similarly has moved from being disparate to centralized and now is trying to decentralize so that the core foundation doesn't have everything resting on it. So, wanted to invite you back to your tables in a conversation with at least one other colleague. There's a handout at your tables that has that jazzy triangle. And there are a couple of questions. One relates to the network that you are here representing and what kind of network you think it is or needs to be. And on the back, there are some questions about the current form of your network. So the invitation is to spend time on the question that most pulls you in, about 7 minutes with a colleague. Just taking some time to apply these frameworks and concepts. Come back in about 7 minutes. So once again, I want to see what's coming up at tables. A couple comments. Anything that's useful? Any ahas? Any head scratchers? Yes.
We were discussing and actually just in your insight on sort of the role of leadership and what that looks like and in these different forms.
Perfect. That's where we're going right after this break. Excellent. Thank you.
We were talking about how some networks actually start off with the very top.
Yes.
With a clear intentionality and clear purpose, but that sometimes that misses some of the building blocks, the trust and the other kind of pieces that sometimes develop in a more loosely organic type of network building process that just sees what emerges. I mean, I think both can be challenging because the see what emerges can also fall apart if you never actually have something that pulls you together and sustains you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it can be all good that a network comes together, has a campaign, does an action, and is done. The question is sometimes, have we lost potential, acknowledging that this wasn't just about a fight, it's a longer battle. And of course, you always end up in rooms with those people who are just itching to go, let's go, the toe tappers. When are we going to take action? You know who you are. And there are other people that, no, let's just build relationship, come on. We need both, right? We need both.
Does it help to actually explain that to people?
Yes. So we actually have a framework we use in my institute called the Dimensions of Collaborative Success. It's a triangle, another triangle. And the dimensions of success we point to are that collaboration rests on, again, shorthand, results, process, and relationship. If you don't get to results, yes, you're not successful. If you don't have a good process, you're also not successful. And if you lose out on relationships, you can also say you're not successful. So how to dynamically balance results, process, and relationship. And there are just people who show up with more orientation in one corner than another, just naturally. So actually putting that in front of people and saying, you know who you are, welcome. But if we're all results people, and this is a long-term battle, maybe we need some relationship people in here too, or do a little relationship building. So that could just be a helpful way of sort of naming what's going on.
One other thing I think what we talked about in that is that the power of disaster or problem to push, and when that goes away or subsides, how to keep that energy going, because urgency will pull people together and make them do something.
Yeah, and so I have some thoughts, probably not now, but urgency can be strategically created, right? not in a way of being misleading. But it's very much been at the center of Food Solutions New England's work, doing some system mapping. We've named a gap. We've said, where are we right now with respect to, this is actually going to take me into the story, so let me go there. So the other network, so I'll go no more than 15 minutes saying that to myself, and please hold me accountable. So Food Solutions New England is this network that I've been most involved with over the last 7 years. I've spent about a third of my consulting time with them. It's a network I feel deeply invested in, and I think it's doing amazing work. And it is not done, and it always feels like it's in a bit of a precarious state, just given things politically, economically, environmentally. FSNE was created 7 years ago when a group of academics were looking at what was going on in our region, noting things like climate change, noting things like economic volatility, noting things like food insecurity. The state of Maine, 25% of all kids don't know where the next meal is coming from. And looking at the convergence of those forces and saying, we get maybe as much as 10% of our food locally in this region, we could be in big trouble if we don't shorten some of those supply chains, get more economic activity going, and really get serious about addressing food insecurity and food injustice. So I was present at a food summit in 2012 that Rich attended and gave a very inspiring presentation about the work in Iowa. And it wasn't his fault what happened next. But the vision, this group of academics had put together this vision, which basically posited that by the year 2060, we could not become totally self-reliant, because in fact that probably wouldn't be sustainable. But we could produce at least 50% of what we eat in this region through farming and fishing. And when that vision was first put out, it set off these waves of enthusiasm and these waves of ire. Some people seeing it as this strange network telling them what to do. New Englanders don't like that. Farmers feeling like they were being told that they're doing it wrong. And some people, I heard a few comments that this is just a socialist plot. Bernie Sanders is behind it. So ultimately what came out of that is that we realized there was enough enthusiasm to keep moving forward. We clearly need to build more ties. To help people understand that this vision was not a prescription. It was meant to tickle our imaginations and help us think like a region, which we were clearly not doing. So a few funders stepped up to the table to invest in this network. Why? Because they knew that changing a regional food system was not the purview, perspective, or the power of a single entity. Because they knew that when we talk about food systems, we're talking about interdependent problems and solutions: land access, food insecurity, economic development, climate resiliency. Because they knew there was already so much that's good that's happening, that if we just connected it more, that would add value. And because of some of those shaking fists, we needed to love on each other a little bit, right? So I rolled out the triangle, and we got to work. And the way that we got to work with a small group of people, diverse and from throughout the regions, my beloved colleague Karen Spiller, a Detroit native, now in Boston, we do a lot of the racial equity work within FSNE. And we just started building relationships, spending days together, telling stories together, sharing our work together, saying, this is not about moving to action. This is really about understanding who we are and what it is we're trying to do, and what the vision is. And we were clear that around this soft infrastructure of relationship building, we needed to build more hard infrastructure to support this network. So this is where leadership comes in. So for us, leadership is a network property. It's built around a number of key and core functions. These are 6 of them, probably not, definitely not all of them. But to build this network, to cement it, to connect it, to align it, and to get moving toward action, we were clear that somebody needed to convene and keep convening. Somebody or bodies needed to coordinate communication and activities. Somebody or bodies needed to facilitate. There needed to be much more weaving done, very strategic. both around bonding and bridging. Bonding is when you work with people within a system or tend to work with each other to get them more connected. Bridging is when you bridge to sort of adjacent systems, which we've done in our racial equity work. So reaching out to the NAACP, reaching out to the Connecticut League of Black and Latino voters, reaching out to those working on justice and other domains, but now have an interest in food. We needed to have robust communications flowing in all directions and not just throw information at people, but curate it artfully, make it accessible. And to be very strategic and artful about design, how we came together, how the structure evolved over time. And so for us, this is the full picture of network leadership with some other functions that I'm probably not naming. These are the core ones. And it was around this, and brace yourselves, if my communications director was here, she would have a fit. I'm going to go to the next slide. But we began to architect this structure, and it has evolved over time. So I'm going to walk through this, say one other thing, turn it back to you for a brief conversation, and we'll be done. So very importantly, we have a backbone convening organization in the form of the University of New Hampshire Sustainability Institute that has stepped into that role of coordination, curation, convening, and keeping funding. That in and of itself adds value. If you just do that, have a ready, willing, and able convener. But around that, we built what's called a process team. At this point, it's a team of 12 people, representatives from the region, diverse racially, from sector, age, gender, who pay attention to the overall process design, setting the Uber agenda, if you will, for the network each year, and just attending to process and relationships as we go forward. That team meets once a month still. And then we have this network team, which is about 30 people now, which have in varying turns either been dedicated to trying to help build alignment around the region with regards to the vision, to furthering the racial equity commitment, and now moving forward regional strategies. And then you have the broader network to which these groups are connected and within which these groups sit. A key network innovation was to actually get funded an ambassadors group, which is still going. So in year 2, when the commitment to racial equity was made, we realized that we needed to have reach into communities that could not come to the table, were not willing to come to the table. And so Senator Marilyn Moore, Karen Spiller, and Julius Kolawale from the African Alliance are paid to go out and do bridging and bonding work. And as a result of their work, this network, the first time I showed up at a convening as a participant, there might have been 2 people of color in the room of 110. Last summit we did, 35% of the group was people of color, which was one benchmark that we set for ourselves in terms of building power, building voice, building inclusion. And we have the ambassadors to thank for that. We've also started a Network Leadership Institute. The ambassadors help feed some dynamic young leaders into that. I run that. It's focused on collaborative leadership skills, network leadership skills, systems thinking, meeting other leaders, touring the region. We have a dynamic cohort now. And those network leaders are helping to animate both the regional community of practice, which is all of the state planning groups from all 6 states get together, and are now including many of the people coming out of the NLI. And we have these 3 strategy teams that are focused on creating a new food narrative, working on sort of the business case for a sustainable, just food system, and then another one that's working on democratic mobilization. And we have something that is a virtual innovation to involve more in the region called the 21-Day Racial Equity Challenge, which happens for 21 days in April. Karen and I spearhead that, sort of a creative brainstorm we had about how to take an exercise that existed in a book and make it more of a network exercise. Year 1, we had 200 people sign up for this. Last year was about 1,500. And it has really helped spread the conversation about justice relating to food and the food system. And of course, the challenge is an ongoing way. How do you keep all this knit together? And the first is just to be aware that it's all there. But we also use a variety of social media and online techniques to keep it. So this is not meant to overwhelm you or suggest that this is the direction to go in. Any one of these pieces we feel like has added pretty significant value. Having it all in place definitely really helps to build the momentum.
So where would you say it is in the triangle?
We're definitely into action mode now. Yeah, I mean, these strategies, we've actually hired a narrative consultant to work with us on the framing, sort of new food narrative. We've got, we're working on a People's Guide to the New England Food System. It's part of a democratic mobilization effort. We're pulling together some strategic convenings around fisheries. We are furthering the racial equity commitment and supporting some local efforts in places like Bridgeport, Connecticut, Haven, Connecticut, uniting with some Black Lives Matter groups and Connecticut Core that does racial justice work. So we're definitely into action mode, but we're also clear that there are many others, right? And so this is not about FS&E taking all of the credit. We have farmed institution, we farmed school, we have many other efforts going on that are clear we want to respect and include. All right, this is what I'm going to do. Since you have a handout for it. Structure is one thing. It's helpful. But what animates the structure are people, and how they show up. And so leadership functions matter, but also this kind of intangible, sort of soft quality of what we bring to these networks matter. Our values, and what a colleague, Sally Gerner, and I are calling these network design principles. So we're playing with this. This is very much a work in progress, but you have a handout related to this, so I want to make sure that I speak to it. We're finding that when these kinds of values animating individual and collective behavior show up in networks, that they can tip more toward this kind of abundance thinking and sharing and thriving. When we build and act in our networks with the spirit of always trying to make connection. When we are striving to become ever inclusive of diversity, not just as a justice issue, but as an intelligence issue. When we are working for equity and creating equitable structures. When we are seeking to distribute power, not hoard it. When we are trying to be transparent with what we're learning and keeping resources flowing of all kinds. When we support not just formally coordinated action, but help people do their own thing, self-organize. When we embrace a spirit of collaboration, when we share resources and share responsibility. When we embrace a spirit of creativity and innovation, and related to that, a growth mindset, acknowledging we don't ever know everything, that we can always learn. And what we're doing now actually may be able to be improved. Maybe it's the wrong thing. And when we can embrace, yes, love, and caring, seeing the other as a legitimate other, that's when a lot of magic happens. That's when you're animating these structures with our humanity. So there is a handout there that I'd invite you to just check out with a colleague for a few minutes here. Just see what pops out at you. And then Rory is going to come up here and take us into the next section. Just have a turn to a colleague, see if anything's jumping out at you, related to that handout or anything else we just discussed. So, my time up here is done, but I'd love to hear if there was a great question just now about New England being, predominantly white, and so why did you decide to do racial equity work? New England is not all white. When you look at Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts, they're rapidly changing demographics. You look at Manchester, New Hampshire, you look at Portland, Maine, you look at Burlington, Vermont, radically changing demographics. And when we start to look at ourselves as a region, almost as a big state, right, start to dissolve some of those lines, that was part of what was occurring. And also when you disaggregate the data, there are highly racialized opportunities and outcomes. That is the most predictive of who has the least opportunities and the lowest level of outcomes. And so it became for us a fundamental justice issue as a way of getting to the other inequities, gender, class, geographic, etc. But to tackle it all at once is hard to do. So this is really the front end of the wedge. Makes sense. One last comment or question before I step aside here. Anything that came up as relative? Yes.
Well, for me, in the work that we're doing, we mapped out that there are 100 organizations, programs, entities, whatever, that should be a stakeholder. Probably most of them are in a healthier, better food system. But their interest in the system may be totally different than the next group's. Their objectives are different. Their strategies are different. Yes, we all have the same goal, a better food system. But within that, the goals and objectives are all over the place. Right. So how do we pull that together? How do we identify common? Is it not a key step to identify common goals and objectives when working with all these?
It is, yeah. And for us, it was partly about creating the vision. Another part of it was doing a system mapping exercise that I'll share about at another time that did lift up some of those common leverage points that were pain points from a diversity of stakeholders. We interviewed 21 stakeholders, including those from conventional ag, offering their perspectives on the system. And then coming up with leverage areas that we felt like were both address systemic issues, but that we would actually have a significant crowd behind. So I could share more of a break. All right. Yes.
Let's give Curtis a really good